Hello and welcome to this Astranti pre-scene video for the strategic case study exam for coffee manufacturer Shinepodd. This is the February 2020 exam. This is the first exam on the new syllabus. But the pre-scenes are presented in mostly the same fashion as in the older 2015 syllabus. We have a lot of information here about a specific company. One noticeable difference for the first pre-scene under this new syllabus compared with the previous ones, of which I've done many, is that there is a higher proportion of the pre-scene dedicated solely to extracts from the individual companies' reports and the individual company's documents, whereas in the previous pre-scenes there would often be a lot of information about the background industry, about the process in which, if it was for this particular company, it would be in the process of how coffee is created, where coffee comes from, etc. But that is a much smaller proportion of this pre-scene. So this is how the video split is going to work. In this first video here, it's going to be very much an introduction, looking at the role in which we are going to be playing as the senior manager at the organization Shinepodd, and talk about how we are going to analyze these videos and start putting in place the kinds of models, etc., that we're going to build on throughout this pre-scene video series. In the second video, we are going to look more specifically at the coffee industry. So that's a section here, first main section of the pre-scene. And then in the third video, we'll look at the organization. So we'll look at Shinepodd. Then we'll move on to the accounts and the published documents. And video 4 will focus primarily on the organization's vision statement, its mission statement, its responsibility statement, and also its organizational charts, and looking at the board of directors, remembering that CIMA still views governance and ethics as being very important parts of the syllabus. These were really brought in and really ramped up in terms of their importance in the previous syllabus, and it looks like that is going to continue. So very important sections there with regards to the overall context of the exam that you are going to be sitting in February 2020. We'll then look at the various different news stories and blog posts relating to Shinepodd, and the articles, the news stories, etc. are very, very important for the case study exam. They appear like they aren't. They appear like it's just a bit of superfluous information, and the articles themselves often don't have that much to look at and think that's a really important point to bring up, that's a really important point to bring up, etc. But what they do is give you an insight into where the examiner is perhaps heading, like the issues where the examiner is heading in the exam. We'll then return to the statements, looking at the principal risks and the internal audit in video 6, that's the risk video, before looking at the different financial statements, share price history, and also the competitor statements in video 7. And that will be the final video in the initial part of this series, looking at the pre-scene. Video 8 will then be the strategic analysis video, which looks at the various different models within the CIMA syllabus and applies the case to them. And the final video, video number 9, is the top 10 most likely unseen issues. And we've been very accurate with our top 10 issues over the course of the case study exam throughout the entire 2015 syllabus. So 4 sittings a year, and of course there's 3 different levels as well. We've averaged 7 to 8 of those top 10 issues arising in each exam. And by the time we've gone through all 9 of these videos, we'll have a really good idea about the organization, a really good idea of the kinds of issues that are facing the company, kinds of issues that are facing the industry as well. And that will give us a really good grounding to take into the exam in February. So before we begin the analysis, I'll just tell you a bit about who I am and also how we are going to go through this video series. So first of all, my name is Peter Steph. I am the head of strategic case study here at Astranti. I've been teaching the strategic case study since 2016. And prior to that, I taught the management and operational case study. I'm also heavily involved in writing the various mock exams that we produce for our course, and also marking those mocks as well, seeing where students are going right, seeing where they are going wrong. And I use that information to help feedback into my video analysis as well, common mistakes that students make. I've also written several of the free study texts that you can use here at Astranti. So on to the video series itself. Essentially, we're going to go through the pre-scene section by section, picking out the various key points, various things that are going to be important for your exam. Also look at how real world companies, or how companies in this actual industry, obviously it's a fictional company in a fictional industry, a fictional country, etc. But there are plenty of parallels with the real world, and that's what we will be tying the analysis to. So look at various key business models as well, some of the things that you will have learnt during your objective test studies, how we can apply some of those models to the case. So SWOT analysis, stakeholder matrices, and so on. We'll also look at likely exam issues that could arise, as in when we're looking through the analysis, are there particular points that they keep referring to? Is that a hint on where the examiner is thinking they may take the exam? What previous questions have come up in previous exams when this kind of information has been given, and so on. And also just key exam hints and tips as well, things to prepare you for the day, ways in which you can perhaps streamline your information, streamline the information within the pre-scene so that it helps you for the exam. Then look at the strategic analysis, our strategic analysis video, which looks at all the different models, lots of the big models, and applies them directly to the pre-scene. So we'll be looking at where the company is, where the company wants to be, and how it's going to get there using various different theories. And we'll conclude the video series by looking at the top 10 most likely issues. These will be based on previous issues that have come up in previous case studies. It will also be based on how much weight is given to particular topics, to particular things within the pre-scene. And how this actual series will work is when we're going through it section by section, I'm going to assume that we have no prior knowledge as we go through it, as in the whole point of this video series should be as if you and I were looking through the videos together, or looking through the pre-scene together. So I'm not going to act as if I've read through the entire pre-scene when I'm going through each individual page. We're going to look at it as if we're seeing everything for the first time. So we're not going to be ruling anything out at any particular stage because of what may come later in the pre-scene or what may come later in information given to us by CIMA. We're just going to assume that every single thing is relevant. We're going to assume that every single sentence is the first time that you or I have seen it, and we're analyzing it based on its own individual, mutually exclusive merits. What I suggest is that you read through a particular section and make notes, and then come back to the start of the video and we'll go through it together. And as already mentioned, at the end of the pre-scene analysis, we will then move on to the strategic analysis and top 10 most likely issues, which in a sense summarize everything that we will have done throughout the pre-scene. And as you're making notes on the pre-scene, remember this is the context for which the exam will be based. So there will be a lot of information here that perhaps won't necessarily be relevant in terms of answering the question. They're not going to be testing us on our knowledge of the pre-scene. They're not going to be testing us on things specifically in the pre-scene. It is the background information that will give us context when we are answering our questions in the exam. So if they are asking us a question on whether they should go ahead with this particular project and give us some information on that project, we will have background information on the industry, background information on the company that will allow us to pinpoint the suitability of this project based on what we know about the organization. Remember that you shouldn't be pre-writing anything based on the pre-scene. So don't assume that they're going to ask us a question on this. I'm going to write out a mock answer based entirely on this information in the pre-scene, and I'm going to ignore anything that comes up in the unseen, because remember, the unseen is the actual exam. The material given to us in the unseen should take precedence over material in the pre-scene if it contradicts. So don't write anything based on the pre-scene or pre-write anything based on the pre-scene, because it is the background information for us to deal with it. It's not the unseen, it's not the exam, it's just the background information. But saying that, we must use the information in the exam, but we must tie it back to the context of the unseen. And your recommendations must be consistent with strategic analysis. So if when we're going through our strategic analysis and we're looking at suitable projects, we're looking at suitable things for the company to undertake, if your recommendation completely flies in the face of all that analysis, it flies in the face of everything that's in the pre-scene, everything's in the unseen, then you're likely to get marked down because it is not a sensible conclusion. So let's look at the first page of the pre-scene. And this particular page just sets the scene. If the pre-scene is the context of the exam, then this page is the context of the pre-scene. It's just telling us who we are playing, the role we are playing within the organization, and also the remit of our responsibilities within that organization. And it's actually a very, very important page for students to look at. And one problem students often have when they get the pre-scene is they skip straight ahead to the risk report. They skip straight ahead to the financial statements or the articles. They don't think about looking at this page because it just looks like very, very basic background information. But actually, this really sets the scene for the kinds of things that we need to be looking for as we progress through the pre-scene. And the most important thing here in the first line is the statement here that you are a senior manager in the finance function at Shinepodd. And that comment there is very important because that is the specific role that CIMA has given to us. And there are specific things that we as a senior manager have to do. And we need to keep those in mind when we are answering questions in the exam, because that is ultimately how we are going to be judged in the exam. Our adherence to that role as the senior manager. And in the CIMA syllabus, they provided us with a list of points, a list of things that will be expected of a senior manager. They defined the role of the senior manager for us in the syllabus. And that looked at ethics, it looked at strategic planning, it looked at risk assessment, it looked at advising management, it looked at sourcing finance. And this also forms a huge bulk of those various different core activities, those various different I can statements. I can advise management on sources of finance. I can advise on projects. I can make strategic decisions, digital or otherwise. I can work with external shareholders. All those different core activity statements that you are going to be tested on. You must prove that you can do those things in the exam. All form part of your role as a senior manager. So it crosses the breadth of the CIMA syllabus. And as you can see, just put on the screen for you there, you've got the different breakdown, the primary breakdowns across the different parts of the syllabus, looking at stakeholders, looking at ethics, looking at strategy from the E3 portion of the syllabus, risk and governance in P3 and funding in F3. So it's very important that you as the student do have this knowledge. Now, the strategic case study exam is not about theory. It's not a test of your theory, it's a test of your business acumen. You're tested on your theory in your E3, P3 and F3 exams. However, the best answers combine the theory with application, with analysis. So it's still very important. If you want to be the student that gets the top marks in the exam, that has the best chance of passing, you need to be able to take this theoretical knowledge and apply it and analyze it effectively. So remember that phrase, the best answers combine theory with application and analysis. And you report directly to the board and advise them on special projects and strategic matters. So again, thinking back to your role, thinking back to strategy there, strategic matters. So that's going to be linking to strategy, it's going to be linking to external shareholders, stakeholders, etc. It's also going to be linking to governance, because we're talking about the board here. It's also going to be linking to risk as well, as that is part of what a senior manager does, and that was a key part of those core activities which make up your role. And this doesn't just affect the content and what you are writing, it also affects how you are writing. Consider the phrase, you report directly to the board. So think about the organization that you work for. Think about the board of directors of the company that you work for. If you were reporting directly to that board, if you were advising them on projects, you were advising them on strategic matters, how do you think they would want your advice? How would you present your advice to the board? Would you look at all the information you have, just compile it all together, say this is all important, this is all relevant, go into the conference room and chuck it all on the desk and say to the board, make something of this, and walk out again? Of course you wouldn't. So as the senior manager in the finance function reporting to the board, it's up to you to analyze the information, compile it into suitable, solid, justified recommendations, and then present that to the board. Present something that is palatable, something that will allow them to look at and make decisions based on, not having to look through it to find whether there's actually any relevant information in it. So think about the writing style here. Think about your audience, who you are actually writing to, and why it's important to give justified recommendations. The next sentence looks at where Shinepodd is based. So it says that Shinepodd is based in Midland, where the currency is the $. Now, whenever you see a currency, you should be thinking about all the issues relating to the economy and also relating to international trade. If we're working in the coffee market, there's a good chance then we are going to be buying and selling things across the world, overseas, across borders, etc. So the currency is going to play a part here, particularly given that it's coffee. And coffee is a commodity, and a commodity is often traded in US dollars. So we do have to think about price fluctuations here. How strong is the $$ compared to the US dollar? So as a result, we need to be thinking about currency risk. There could be issues with the fluctuating price, and that of course again ties in with our F3 studies. Currency risk, a key part of your F3 studies. But what I would say here is that you were tested on your knowledge of how to actually calculate hedging and futures, options, pricing, etc. You covered all that in your F3 studies. You won't be asked to do calculations in the strategic case study exam. Students often ask me this question, and they do not need to do it. If you feel you need to do certain calculations, particularly when looking at the financial statements, looking at gearing ratios, etc., to aid your analysis, by all means do that. If it does help aid your analysis, then do it, but there will not be specific marks for it. You won't be asked to do a specific calculation within the exam. So when you are thinking about hedging, when you're thinking about currency risks, currency fluctuations, you should be thinking about them from a more holistic strategic perspective, as what are the benefits of hedging against them? What are the reasons why you would hedge against them? What are the reasons for having currency reserves, etc.? And on the subject of currency reserves, Midland does require companies to prepare their financial statements in accordance with the International Financial Reporting Standards, which of course, you can get things like IAS 21, etc., does require organizations to have these currency reserve setups to incorporate the risk of transaction and translation risk. And specifically when we think about this with regards to Shinepodd, the fact that they are preparing their statements in accordance with IFRS means that it is easier to branch out into different markets. It's easier to set up subsidiaries in different markets, etc., because the accounts are already being prepared in a way that allows for the incorporation of other organizations, provided they are also based in countries that prepare their financial statements in accordance with the International Financial Reporting Standards. And then we have our first indication of the size of Shinepodd. They are a quoted public entity on the Midland Stock Exchange. And this is generally a strength of the organization when you are quoted on the stock exchange. Yes, it does mean that there are additional regulations, and we can see that the Midland Exchange is active and well regulated, but it's generally considered a strength due to the size of the organization, the ability to raise finance. So we can raise finance on the stock market through rights issues, through selling more shares, etc. And also from a perspective of hiring employees and trading with organizations all over the world. There's an additional level of prestige that comes from being a public company. There's also the fact that you may be considered or perceived to be more stable, to be a larger, more powerful, more stable organization and a more prestigious organization. So that helps with the hiring of directors, but also the hiring of ambitious young employees as well. So that's a strength of the organization. And it does mean as well that the organization is expected to adhere to the Midland Code of Corporate Governance and sets out detailed regulations relating to the governance arrangements of quoted companies. And when you do see a specific code name here, such as the Midland Code of Governance, within the context of the CIMA syllabus, that can be, in a sense, extrapolated and compared with the UK Code of Corporate Governance from your syllabus. So think of the Midland Code of Governance as being the UK Code of Governance. So all the different requirements of the UK Code of Governance, so the separation of the chairperson, the chief executive officer, the different committees, the nomination, remuneration, audit committee, etc., an even number of executive directors and non-executive directors, all of those sorts of things can be applied to Shinepodd here. So later in the video series, when we look at the board of directors, those are the sorts of things that we'll be looking for. How well does the organization comply with the code of governance? So as you can see, just from this very, very small page, just a couple of sentences, we've actually been able to pull out quite a lot of information that we can build on going forward. And before I finish, just going to run through a list of various different models that we can perhaps look at and analyze as we are going through building on these as we go through the pre-scene. So one that I've already brought up here is the SWOT analysis. As you're going through, you should be looking, and we'll be looking, those of you watching this video series, at the different strengths, weaknesses of the company and also the opportunities and threats that are facing it. Other good models to look at would be your stakeholder matrix. Think about the different stakeholders of the organization. We're a quoted company, so we're going to have shareholders. We've already established there is a board of directors. We also need to think about our customers, our employees, the various different organizations that we work with. Perhaps we are working with various different farmers, We're also going to be working with companies that produce various different types of coffee to use in our machines, working with them as strategic partners rather than buyers or suppliers. Also, it hasn't told us yet about where our machines are made, whether we have our own machines or whether we just produce pods that go in a more generic machine. If you think about organizations like Nespresso, organizations like Tassimo, they do not actually produce their own machines. They are licensed as official original manufacturers to companies such as Bosch, etc., who produce the machines under the Tassimo name, for example. So I've put that list on the screen. Another one I've put in here is banks. So if we do have lots of money that we owe, if we've taken out a significant amount of debt financing, then the bank is also going to be a key stakeholder to the organization. Also think, given that this is ultimately a manufacturing company in some ways with regards to coffee, you need to think about the value chain. It's not usually tested at strategic level, but it does have its uses. We can look at ways in which the organization does add value that it ultimately passes on to the consumer, even if it's just looking at secondary things. Just the fact that we have this finance function here that works as a strategic partner within the organization, helping on projects and strategic matters, is part of the infrastructure of the organization, which is a key way in which the company adds value. You can also think about various different plans, various different strategic tools such as ANSOS, such as porters, etc. Looking at those and thinking how this company could grow, how it could expand, how it could develop its own strategies. And also, given the nature of the industry, we can also think about various different parts of the industry or various different things affecting the industry, a lot of which would perhaps be more general knowledge than sometimes with the case studies where it's very, very obscure industries. So we can run through a list of things that we know just from hearing in the news that kind of affect the coffee industry and just how those are going to have an impact on this company. And one thing I do want to bring up is ethics as well. Ethics is a very, very important part of the CIMA syllabus. And in the previous syllabus, across the many different exams that were sat between 2015 and 2019, 5 variants it was at the time in each sitting. Ethics generally came up in 2 to 3 of those variants every single time in some way, shape or form. So incredibly important subject. And ethics is very important, particularly in the coffee industry. And the main reason for that is who are the suppliers of coffee? Coffee is often grown by quite poor farmers in third world countries and developing countries. And there's been a lot of talk about the exploitation of these farmers in these countries. And so it's very important, particularly in this day and age, if you think about the people who purchase coffee, one of the driving forces behind coffee purchasing in the last few years has been people who would be classified as millennials, who are very into going to coffee shops, etc. And coffee shops they're still springing up everywhere. There was a big boom about a decade ago in Europe. It's still been popular for obviously a long, long time, but there's been a huge increase. In fact, in the last 30 years, coffee consumption around the world has doubled. That's a huge proportion in only 30 years, considering that coffee has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, that it's doubled in the last 30 years. And that's primarily driven by the increase in coffee shops and that millennials who are very much into coffee, very much into going to coffee shops, are becoming part of the driving force of the economy. And what do millennials care about? Social things. They don't want to deal with organizations that are exploiting poor farmers in developing countries. So when we're thinking about our pastel analysis as well, we need to think about ethics, we need to think about social. So I've just put a few parts of the pastel analysis that we can build on going forward. Politically, it is a commodity, and therefore there's often a lot of trade amongst different countries. Not quite politicized to the same extent that something like oil would be, but it's still very important to the economies of certain countries, particularly those in Asia and in South America. From an economy perspective, the consumption of coffee has doubled in the 30 years. More and more people are spending more and more money on coffee. Then, of course, from a social aspect, a lot of that is driven by millennials who care a lot more than other generations about ethical issues such as the treatment of farmers. A few tech things here relating to the machines used to produce the coffee, but also the machines that we are going to be using to create the coffee within the individual's home. From an environmental perspective, climate change is a very big hot topic in the current climate, and the water usage of coffee is exceptionally high. Use a lot of water just to produce a certain amount of coffee beans. So there's a big issue with the water usage of coffee. And also legal when thinking about tax, thinking about workers' rights, which again tie back to this general idea about the ethical issues over farmers. And another point that I just want to bring up about farmers was that one of the big issues with coffee, the main impact that it's having on farmers is the increase in consumption. It's doubled in 30 years, whereas production is actually decreasing. In fact, the net production to consumption decreased for the fourth straight year in a row in the previous year. So in a sense, actually consumption is higher than production at the moment. So the net is decreasing. The net production of coffee is decreasing. And also this idea of coffee being a commodity has a real impact on farmers, because they are often quite small local businesses or even just individually owned sole traders. And so this whole idea of coffee being a commodity is not going to be beneficial to them. It was not beneficial to them because, of course, they can't trade on the commodity market to the same extent. They can only just sell what they produce. And just a quick bit of information here from searching on the commodities market is the standard value, the standard weightage tonnage of a commodities future contract for coffee is 17,000 kilograms. So that's a huge proportion. The average small farmer who just perhaps has one small farm with a field is not going to be producing on that level. So they are not sheltered. They're not able to hedge against the currency fluctuation. That's why it has such an impact on them. And this is why there have been issues with the exploitation of farmers in developing worlds. And also from a social perspective as well. So building in from the pestle social part to this whole idea of it affecting farmers is that as these developing worlds become more and more developed, the cities become more and more developed, the types of jobs available become more and more developed. And one of the biggest problems facing the coffee producing market, the coffee producing industry today, is that the average age of farmers is getting higher and higher and higher. And this is because all the younger people within these developing worlds are moving to the cities and they are working more in kind of offices, etc. They're not becoming farmers. And so in the future, in the next 20 to 30 years, there could be a real shortage of coffee farmers, particularly given that the population of the world is increasing and the demand for coffee is increasing as well. So hopefully we've got quite a lot of information to work on, to build on as we progress through this video series. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it and more importantly you have found it useful. I'd like to finish by just telling you a few things about the products that we produce here at Astranti and the ones that are part of our course. So these materials can all be purchased as part of the course or purchased individually. So we have our study text. We have 3 study texts for all the objective test exams. So 3 study texts for E1, P1, F2, F3, etc. But we also have the study text specifically for the case study exams, split into 2 parts. The first is about how to approach the exam, how to analyze the information, how to plan your answers, how to write your answers, and also the second part, which looks at the key theories from the objective test levels that are relevant to the particular case study. So if you are looking at P2, F2, E2 for the management exam, F3, P3, E3 for the strategic case study exam, and so on. We have our course videos, which look at how to plan your answers, how to manage your time effectively. These are the key reasons why people fail the exam. We have our pre-scene analysis, which looks at the pre-scene in a lot of depth, applies key information to that, and also concludes with the strategic analysis, where we look at the various different models in the CIMA syllabus and apply them to the case, and also the top 10 most likely issues to arise in your exam. Generally, we have a 70 to 80% accuracy rate on our top 10 issues. Our industry pack, which details in great depth the history and the current contemporary issues within the particular industry that the pre-scene is based on. We also have 20 to 25 industry examples that you can use within your answers. We have mock exams that can be purchased with or without marking and feedback, where you can get some real exam practice in, look for the kinds of things that the examiner is going to bring up in the exam, and also get marking and feedback from expert markers who have marked for CIMA and for us for many years, who know exactly the kinds of things that the examiner is looking for, exactly the kinds of mistakes that students often make, and can provide lots of detailed feedback to ensure that you improve on your performance. We also have our masterclasses, which are 2 day-long classes which look at all the key issues facing students in the exam. We will also go through live planning, showing you how to plan your answers effectively, how to write your answers effectively. Again, key things that cause people to fail the strategic case study exam, or any of the case study exams for that matter. And also, if you do sign up for our course, provided that you have filled out your forms, provided that you have submitted your mocks, provided you have done everything to show that you have really given it your all to try and pass this exam, we also offer a pass guarantee, giving a free resit to anyone who fails the exam.